The man tied to the cottonwood was already supposed to be dead. Elias Thorne could see that from 100 yards off, the slump of the body, a final argument against the prairie sun. Vultures circled high, patient as priests. Whoever did this hadn't been interested in a quick kill. They wanted a sermon of suffering, preached by thirst and heat and fear. Elias reined in his horse, the leather creaking like old bones. He wasn't a man who went looking for trouble. Trouble had a way of finding him anyway, a loyal hound he'd been trying to lose since the war. He had his daughter, Sarah, to think of. He had the ranch, a stubborn patch of dust, and hope that barely kept them fed. He should turn around, ride back to the cabin, bolt the door, and forget he'd seen anything but the endless, indifferent sky. Every instinct for survival, honed in muddy trenches and bloody fields, screamed at him to leave it be. This was not his fight. This was a message, and he was not the intended recipient. But as he watched, the man's head lifted, a barely perceptible motion, a flicker of life in a canvas of death. Elias cursed, a low, gravelly sound swallowed by the wind. He knew that look. He had worn it himself. It was the look of a man with nothing left but the raw, animal will to draw one more breath. Leaving him there wasn't just turning his back, it was pulling the trigger himself. He swung down from his horse, the dust puffing up around his worn boots. The world shrank to the space between him and the tree. Elias walked toward the tree, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. It wasn't a weapon of aggression. It was a tool. For cutting rope, for skinning game, for carving his daughter's small toys out of scrap wood. Now, it felt heavy with consequence. The man was native, his skin the color of baked earth, streaked with dried blood and dirt. His wrists were bound to the trunk with rawhide, pulled so tight the flesh was swollen and purple. A crude gag was stuffed in his mouth. His eyes, though, were what held Elias captive. They were black, deep-set, and blazing with a defiant fire that should have been extinguished hours ago. They followed Elias's every move, not with a plea for help, but with a challenge, as if to say, "What kind of man are you?" Elias had been asking himself that same question for 10 years. He knelt, pulled the knife, and saw the man flinch, a tightening of muscle across his bare chest. Elias paused, holding the blade where the man could see it. He didn't offer a comforting word. Words were cheap currency out here. Instead, he simply turned the knife and began to saw at the rawhide on the man's wrists. The fibers were tough, baked hard by the sun. Each pull of the blade was a decision. Each rasp of steel against leather was a commitment he couldn't take back. Once this rope was cut, this man's fate, for better or worse, was tied to his. He could feel the eyes of Silas Blackwood's men on his back, even though they were miles away. They were the only ones cruel enough and bold enough for a thing like this. They wanted his land, his water. They wanted him gone. This act, this simple, silent mercy, was an act of war against them. The first rope snapped free. The man's arm fell limp. Elias moved to the other, his movements deliberate, methodical. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own breathing and the sawing of the knife. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a participant, and on the unforgiving prairie, there was no such thing as a spectator. He brought the man back to the cabin, slung over his horse, a dead weight that occasionally groaned with the agony of returning circulation. Sarah was waiting on the porch, a small, fierce silhouette against the setting sun. She was 7, with her mother's wide, serious eyes and a quietness that Elias both cherished and feared. When she saw the body on the horse, her face, usually so composed, crumpled with alarm. "Papa, who is that?" Her voice was a whisper, as if a louder sound might invite the danger inside. "Just a man who needed help, sweetheart," Elias said. his own voice strained. He slid the unconscious man off the horse, the effort making him grunt. He was heavier than he looked, solid muscle and bone. He carried him inside and laid him on the spare cot, a piece of furniture that had remained empty since his wife, Martha, had passed. The presence of a stranger in that space felt like a violation of a sacred memory. A flashback hit him, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass. Martha, pale and sweating in that same bed, her breath coming in shallow rasps, the cholera taking her piece by piece while he stood by. Helpless. He had fought in a war and seen horrors, but nothing had unmanned him like watching the life drain from the person who was his whole world. That loss had hollowed him out, leaving him with a single imperative: protect Sarah. And now he had brought the wolf to her door. "Bolt the door, Sarah," he commanded, his voice harsher than he intended. She flinched but obeyed, the heavy wooden bolt sliding home with a sound of finality. It wasn't to keep the stranger in, it was to keep the world he came from out. Elias lit a lantern, the flickering yellow light dancing across the stranger's face, revealing a map of pain. He fetched a basin of water and a clean rag. As he began to clean the wounds, he felt Sarah's eyes on him. She stood in the corner, clutching the small wooden bird he'd carved for her, her knuckles white. She was afraid. Not of the wounded man, but for her father. She knew, with the unnerving wisdom of a child who has known loss, that this act of kindness was a pebble tossed into a still pond, and the ripples were coming for them. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick and watchful. Elias worked with a grim focus, cleaning the lacerations on the man's chest and arms. They were deliberate, made with a whip or a branch, meant to bleed but not to kill quickly. He pulled the gag from the man's mouth, a filthy piece of cloth that smelled of sweat and fear. The man's lips were cracked and swollen. Elias dipped the corner of the rag in the water and gently moistened them. For the first time, a flicker of something other than defiance passed through the man's eyes. It might have been gratitude, it might have been surprise, or it might have been nothing more than the lantern light. Elias didn't know. He worked on, stitching the deepest of the gashes with a needle and thread he'd sterilized in the fire. His hands, usually clumsy with anything more delicate than a hammer or a rein, were surprisingly steady. He was a rancher, a farmer, a carpenter, but he had also been a soldier, and he knew his way around a wound. He knew the geography of a body in distress. As he worked, the wind picked up outside, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. It was a lonely, mournful sound, the voice of the prairie itself. It seemed to whisper a warning. Through the small, grimy window, Elias saw 3 riders cresting the far ridge. They were just dark shapes against the bruised twilight sky, but he knew who they were: Blackwood's men. They were patrolling, hunting. Maybe they were coming back to admire their handiwork at the cottonwood tree. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had invited this man in, and now his enemies were at the horizon. He glanced at Sarah, who had her face pressed to the window, her breath fogging the glass. She saw them too. He moved to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He was protecting a man he didn't know from men he knew all too well, and his daughter was caught in the crossfire. The weight of his choice pressed down on him, heavier than the wounded man had been on his shoulders. By morning, the stranger was conscious. He didn't speak, merely watched Elias with those same intense, unreadable eyes. Elias offered him water, which he drank greedily, and then a bowl of thin broth, which he took more slowly. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. Finally, the man spoke, his voice a dry rasp, like stones scraping together. "They will come." It wasn't a question or a warning. It was a statement of fact. "Let them," Elias replied, his voice equally flat. It was a foolish, prideful thing to say, but he would not show fear. Not in front of this man, and not in front of his daughter. The man's gaze shifted from Elias to Sarah, who was sitting at the small wooden table, sketching on a piece of slate. She drew the same things over and over. The cabin, her father, a bird in flight. The man watched her for a long time, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He looked back at Elias. Why? The one word held a universe of questions. Why did you cut me down? Why risk yourself? Why bring me here? Elias didn't have a simple answer. He thought of the war, of the men he'd left behind, the ones he couldn't save. He thought of Martha and the crushing helplessness of her death. Because no man should die tied to a tree, he said finally. It was the truest thing he could offer. The man seemed to accept this. He nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to cost him a great deal of effort. The conversation was over. An understanding had been reached, not in words, but in the shared space of that small, tense room. They were two men from different worlds, bound by a single act of defiance. Later that day, as Elias was chopping wood outside, the man sat up on the cot. He beckoned Sarah over. Hesitantly, she approached, her slate clutched to her chest. He pointed to her drawing of the bird. He made a gesture with his hands, like wings soaring. Sarah smiled, a rare, brilliant flash of light in the dim cabin. It was the first time Elias had seen her truly smile in weeks. A fragile bridge was being built in the heart of the storm. The knock on the door came 2 days later. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, impatient pounding that shook the entire frame. Sarah gasped, dropping her slate, which cracked on the floorboards. Elias put a finger to his lips, his eyes locking with Kemez. He had finally learned the man's name in another short, clipped exchange. Keme. It meant secret in his tongue, a fitting name. Elias gestured for Keme to lie flat and pull the blanket up, to feign sleep or unconsciousness. He then motioned for Sarah to hide in the small loft, a space she could scramble into that was hidden from the main room. He took a deep breath, wiped the nervous sweat from his palms onto his trousers, and opened the door. 3 of Blackwood's men stood there. At the front was Jed, a man with a stained beard and cruel, piggy eyes. "Thorn," Jed sneered, his gaze sweeping past Elias to inspect the cabin's interior. "Heard you had some company." Elias leaned against the doorframe, trying to look casual, trying to make his body a barrier. "Just me and the girl." "Same as always." Jed's eyes narrowed. "Funny. We had a problem a few days back. An Injun we was disciplining. Seems he wandered off before his lesson was over. You ain't seen a stray, have you? Bloody, half dead. Shouldn't be hard to spot." The air crackled with tension. Elias could feel Kemez's stillness behind him, the coiled energy of a predator pretending to be prey. He could feel Sarah's terrified silence from the loft above. His world had shrunk to this single moment, this one lie. Everything depended on it. "Can't say that I have," Elias said, his voice level. "Been busy. Fences to mend." Jed stared at him, a long, unnerving silence. He was sniffing for lies, for the scent of fear. He took a step forward, trying to push his way in. "Mind if we take a look? Just to be sure." Elias didn't move. He planted his feet. "You're not welcome in my house, Jed." This was it, the line in the sand. For a moment, Jed looked ready to force the issue. His hand drifted towards the pistol at his hip. But then he seemed to think better of it. Starting a gunfight in broad daylight over a hunch wasn't smart, even for him. He spat on the ground near Elias's feet. "You keep to yourself, Thorn. This land has a way of swallowing up people who get too neighborly with the wrong kind." He and his men turned and mounted their horses, riding away in a cloud of dust and malice. Elias slowly closed the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned against it, his knees weak with relief. What would you do? With your child watching from the shadows and a man's life depending on your nerve, would you have stood your ground? Elias had, but he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the payment for his kindness. The next night, Keme was gone. He left as silently as he had lived in the cabin for the past few days. There was no goodbye. Elias woke just before dawn to a sense of emptiness in the room. The cot was vacant, the blanket folded neatly. On the small table beside it lay a single object, a small bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of scrap pine. It was a perfect replica of the one Sarah had drawn on her slate, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Elias picked it up. It was smooth and light in his calloused hand, a small, tangible piece of a bond, forged in silence and danger. He felt a strange pang of disappointment, almost of abandonment. He had risked everything for this man, and he had vanished into the darkness without a word. He told himself he wanted the danger gone from his house, but now that it was, the silence felt different. It felt less like peace and more like loneliness. Sarah came down from the loft, her eyes going straight to the empty cot. "He's gone?" she asked, her voice small. Elias nodded, holding out the carved bird. Her face lit up. She took it and held it tight in her small hand, a treasure. For her, it was enough. For Elias, the questions lingered. Had he done the right thing? Had he simply postponed the inevitable for both himself and for Keme? Blackwood's threat still hung over the ranch like a gathering storm. Jed and his men would not forget his defiance. They would be back. Now he was alone again, with no ally, no witness. He had stared down the devil and won the moment, but he knew the war was far from over. He walked outside into the cold morning air, the carved bird still in his pocket. He looked out at the vast, empty prairie. He had bought another day of peace for his daughter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had paid for it on credit, and the bill was about to come due. The morning was unnervingly quiet. The wind had died down, and the air was still. A thin layer of frost clung to the pump handle. Elias went about his chores with a heavy sense of foreboding. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound made him flinch. He kept his rifle close, leaning it against the fence as he mended it, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was a man living on a razor's edge, waiting for the fall. It was Sarah who saw it first. "Papa," she said, her voice tight with a fear that made Elias's blood run cold. He followed her gaze. On the eastern ridge, a place he had watched for Blackwood's men, was a cloud of dust. But this was different. It wasn't the small, hurried plume of 3 or 4 riders. This was a slow-moving, immense cloud, the kind made by a great herd of buffalo or an army. Elias's heart sank. This was it. Blackwood was done with threats. He was bringing all his hired guns, coming to burn him out, to erase him from the land. This was the payment he had been expecting. "Sarah," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "go to the storm cellar. Take the bird. Do not come out until I come and get you. Do you understand?" She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror, but she nodded. She had practiced this before. She knew the drill for when the real trouble came. She clutched her wooden bird and scrambled toward the heavy cellar doors behind the cabin. Elias watched until she was safely inside before turning back to the approaching dust cloud. He ran inside, grabbed his rifle and a box of cartridges, and returned to the porch. He was one man, one rifle, against what looked like an army. A bitter, wry smile touched his lips. It was a fool's stand. He had survived a war only to die on his own porch, for a moment of foolish compassion. He thought of Martha, of his promise to keep Sarah safe. He had failed. But he would not fail to fight. He would make them pay for every inch of ground. He chambered around, the metallic click echoing in the profound silence. He would die on his feet. He would die a father. He would die the man he had chosen to be when he cut that first rope. He settled the stock of the rifle against his shoulder and waited for the enemy to take form. The dust began to settle as the riders drew closer, and the image that emerged was not what Elias had expected. It was not Blackwood and his band of thugs. The riders were lean, their faces painted, their hair long and black. They were native warriors, dozens of them. They rode with a fluid grace, their ponies moving as one. They formed a long, silent line in front of his cabin, just beyond rifle range. There were at least 70 of them, a formidable, intimidating force that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. At their head, mounted on a proud-looking pinto, was Kame. He was no longer the broken, wounded man from the cot. He was dressed in buckskin, a quiver of arrows on his back, a lance in his hand. He sat tall and straight, a leader, a chief. Elias's mind reeled. This was a reversal so profound it left him breathless. He had been prepared for a fight with his enemies, not a confrontation with his friend. Was it a confrontation? He didn't know. The warriors were utterly still, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on him. Was this a show of force? A threat? Had he saved a man only to have him return with his entire tribe to claim the land, to take revenge for some past wrong he knew nothing about? The irony was so thick he could taste it. He had defied the white man who wanted his land, only to be faced with the people who had owned it first. His rifle felt impossibly heavy. To fire it now would be suicide. To lay it down would be surrender. He was trapped, caught between two worlds belonging to neither. He stood his ground on the porch, his face a mask of grim resolve, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, a silent negotiation of power and intent taking place across the 100 yards of dusty earth that separated them. Kame dismounted and began to walk toward the cabin. He was unarmed, his hands empty at his sides. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his eyes locked on Elias. Elias remained on the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready. He did not lower it. Trust was a currency he couldn't afford to spend twice in 1 week. The 70 warriors watched, silent and unmoving as stone. The fate of this moment, and perhaps the fate of his entire future, rested on the space between these two men. Kime stopped about 20 feet from the porch. He did not speak. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small object. He held it up in the palm of his hand for Elias to see. It was another carved bird, identical to the one he had left for Sarah. It was a symbol, a token. I remember. Then, Kem did something that broke the spell of tension. He looked at Elias, and then he looked past him, toward the distant ridge where Blackwood's ranch lay. He pointed toward it with his chin. Then he swept his arm in a wide arc, indicating Elias's land, the cabin, the barn, the small pasture. He brought his hands together in front of him, lacing his fingers tight, a gesture of alliance, of protection. He looked back at Elias, and for the first time, his expression was clear. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The debt was being repaid. The 70 warriors were not here to attack him. They were here to stand with him. Elias slowly, deliberately lowered the rifle. He leaned it against the porch railing. The breath he had been holding escaped him in a long, shuddering sigh. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He had not brought ruin upon his house. He had brought guardians. He gave a single, sharp nod to Keme, a nod of acceptance, of gratitude, of understanding. Keme nodded back. No more words were needed. The agreement was sealed. In the silence of the prairie, a pact had been made, not of ink and paper, but of shared risk and mutual respect. An outcast rancher and a native chief had found common ground, and on that ground, they would make their stand. In the days that followed, Blackwood's men came probing again. They rode the edge of Elias's property, their arrogance palpable. But this time, they did not approach the cabin. From the ridges and the cottonwood groves, silent figures on horseback watched them. Kem's warriors were a constant, quiet presence, a living fence Elias could never have built. They didn't threaten. They didn't shout. They simply were. Their presence was a statement more powerful than any gunshot. Blackwood, for all his money and influence, could not fight a ghost army that melted into the landscape. His power was built on fear, on isolating his victims. He couldn't isolate a man who was no longer alone. The pressure ceased. The threat receded, not gone, but pushed back to a safe distance. Elias could finally breathe. He could watch Sarah play in the yard without his hand hovering over a weapon. Life returned to a rhythm of chores and seasons, not of fear and survival. Sometimes, Keme would ride to the cabin alone. He and Elias would share a cup of coffee on the porch, speaking very little. They would watch the sun set, two sentinels guarding their small patch of peace. Keem taught Sarah how to track rabbits, how to read the clouds for rain. He taught Elias which roots were medicine and which were poison. Elias, in turn, showed him how to mend a gear on the water pump. They were building something more lasting than an alliance. They were building a fragile, tentative friendship. One evening, as the sky bled into purple and orange, Elias stood on his porch, Sarah asleep inside. He saw Keem and a dozen of his warriors riding a slow patrol along the creek bed. They were a part of his landscape now, as natural as the hawks and the mesas. He thought back to the man tied to the tree, a symbol of absolute despair, and he looked out at the warriors, a symbol of unbreakable community. He had sought only to save one man's life. He had ended up saving his own. The future was still uncertain, a vast, untamed prairie stretching before him. But for the first time since Martha's death, it did not look empty. It looked like hope.